Well, what do these ideas have to tell us as modern Jews? I don't know that most of us are willing to believe in an actually embodied God. For better or worse, we are just Western enough and Maimonidean enough that we don't think of God as having a body or a bunch of bodies. And yet it's my contention that even when we disagree with what's in the Tanakh, we're free to disagree, to debate with the Tanakh, but we're never free to completely reject it. Anything that's in our scripture is there to teach us something. In a sense, we Jews can never become supersessionists. If it's in our holy writings, it's there to teach us something, and we've got to figure out what it is that we can learn from it, even if we don't fully accept the idea. And I think actually that these ideas of God's body do have a great deal to teach us. For starters, and a few of us have already been chatting about this a little bit, the idea of God's body, God having a body, is a very concrete idea that protects us from thinking of God only in the abstract. The Jewish God is a personal God. A God who may be the master of the whole universe, yes, of course, but is also our own personal God, the God of our family, the God of us as individuals. And a God that has a body is a God that is similar to us, a God whom we can relate to. And therefore, that thinking of God in these concrete terms prevents God from becoming too abstract, as indeed God became for Mordechai Kaplan, and for, I think, some other Jewish rationalist philosophers. Furthermore, a God who has a body is a God, a being who has a body is a being who can be damaged, a being who can feel pain. And this reminds me of a core Jewish idea that was expressed most of all, thinking of 20th century Jewish philosophers, was expressed most of all and most eloquently by Abraham Joshua Heschel, when he speaks of the traditional Jewish God of pathos. This God who has strong emotions and who feels pain on behalf of God's creation and on behalf of the Jewish people. A God who can feel pain, a God who has a body, is therefore a God who can feel pain. But the interesting thing is, and here's where I think the older J.E. idea of the multiply embodied God is, paradoxically enough, more monotheistic than P's idea of the kavod as a single body. A God that has multiple bodies can feel pain. And yet a God that has multiple bodies completely transcends the limitations of embodiment. The reason that theologians have great trouble with the idea of God having a body is that a body by definition is limited. And God, by definition, at least the monotheistic God, is limitless. Well, if you've got a God with one body, that body could be limited. If you've got a God with no bodies, it's hard to see how that God can truly be a God for human beings, who relates to, has empathy for human beings, and suffers along with human beings. But the old fluid God of J and E and Hosea and some other texts, that God, on the one hand, because it's an embodied God, can feel pathos and can feel pain, and yet that God has no limitations. Because even if one of these bodies is destroyed, there are other bodies elsewhere. So in a paradoxical way, I actually think that the most bizarre of all the different ideas we've been talking about, the idea of the multiply embodied God, is the most monotheistic God. That's the God who is at once immanent and transcendent. Immanent because that God is fully in the world, can be fully in the world in many different places in the world, but transcendent because that God vastly is beyond any one body. And so this old idea, and then the idea as it reoccurs in some forms of Kabbalah, at first glance it seems pagan, I know. But I think that when you think it through, you realize that this is the most monotheistic God of pathos. And that the other attempts at imagining God without a body lose something that this notion at once retains, even as this notion protects God's transcendence, God's uniqueness, because God's body is so different from our body in its multiplicity. Precisely the multiplicity is what makes God unique, what makes God echad. Yes?